So we are even diverse in that country, let alone in East Africa or in the whole continent. And then you come here and you're like, oh, you are one person actually. You are like all people who look like you who are actually just one person. But now I come.
Right. Can everybody hear me now? Excellent. We're now live streaming. Again, remember to turn your video off if you don't wish to be on our live stream. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Mary Colwell for tonight's talk. I think I was reading. Sorry, we're just getting a little bit of feedback on this. Sorry, Mary.
It's all right, no worries.
We're just trying to turn things off. Hopefully, we should be okay. So yes, I thought I'd go and read some of the reviews of Mary's books, and the words that came out. Some of the words, there were a lot of words about them because there's a lot of very good reviews. Particularly about this latest book, were courage, bravery, calmness, thoughtfulness, and balance. And given the topic of the talk tonight, I was thinking that's such a wonderful range of qualities to have when you're writing about something that can be seen as being quite controversial. And the other things, of course, about Mary is the range of things that she does. There's obviously Mary is an author, a producer, a campaigner for nature. She's won numerous awards.
But if you'd like to settle for you, that works too. We're not native speakers. We have an accent.
Sorry, I'm having to silence people. And everybody, please make sure they're on mute. And also, Mary's obviously heading up the Curlew Recovery Partnership. She's chair of that movement, and also campaigning for a natural history GCSE. So I'm quite amazed that she actually has time to come and do talks as well. So to take up no more of Mary's time than necessary, I'll hand over to Mary for the talk tonight. And Mary, thank you so much for making time to talk to us. Mary will talk for about an hour, and then we'll take questions after that. So Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just start sharing my screen. Let's see if I got it right. Video, share. And can you all see that?
Yes, it just needs to be turned into, yes, that's right.
That's it? Are we all okay? Excellent. Well, I can't see anybody now, so if you all go away, and I won't know. But it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thank you very much for asking me. Just a heads up, I have literally just crawling out of the pit of COVID, so if my voice or I indeed keel over, that would be why. But at the moment, we just seem to be okay. It's my first sort of venture outside my home, if you like, since getting it. And it's not much fun, is it, for those of you who've had it?
Yeah.
So, the title of this talk covers, actually, it's not just about predators. It's going to be about predators, curlews, and the GCSE, as Rachel said. But the title of the talk is Living with Predators in Britain, It's Complicated, Beak, Tooth and Claw. And it really is. And so I hope that what I can do is give my point of view on how the issues are sort of panning out in sort of modern Britain. Not come to any, I don't tell people what to think, but I hope I can help inform the debate and help people to make up their own minds, because it's not always obvious. And sometimes the issues around conservation are very complicated and very nuanced. And unless you're sort of steeped in it day in, day out. A lot of those get lost in the clamour, particularly on social media. So that's what I hope to do and what I've tried to do. So these are the guys that cause quite a lot of trouble, and certainly caused me a bit of trouble recently. And the common, what we call mesopredators in Britain, the common middle-sized predators, of which we have an awful lot of. And the reason that I became very interested in our relationship with these animals is because of my work that I do on curlews. So to start the evening, I'm going to talk a bit about that because it gives interesting background. It gives the sort of reason why I got so interested in it. For those of you who've heard a curlew talk by me before, apologies, but I hope this is just a refresher. If you haven't, I hope this gives you some background. I'm sure to this audience, there's absolutely no need to explain what this is. It's the Eurasian curlew, and it's a bird that I absolutely love and have a real passion for, our largest wading bird. And it's, I think, an absolute icon of the wild. And that's its name, Numenius arquata. Numenius means new moon, arquata is sort of an archer's bow. So its sort of official, if you like, name is related to the curve of its bill. So it's the new moon bird. And that's how we normally see it, as all sort of curvy and gorgeous, and that long, beautiful sculptural bill, the sort of roundness. It's at once comic with its little head and very long nose, but also always elegant. It can walk in the muddiest, gloopiest places, but still look like a ballerina. I find them fascinating. But it's not just what they look like, it's how they sound, which we'll come on to in a second. So Britain's largest wading bird, Europe, so Eurasian curlew, and that's its distribution, its breeding distribution in yellow, and its overwintering can reach as far south as those blue areas. So quite widespread. And it is estimated that there are about 1 million curlews across that range. Nobody really knows for sure because so many of them are in places that are not that well monitored, but of that order, I suppose. That's quite an old figure though, so it may well be a lot less than that now. In Britain, we have around about, I don't know, 48,000, something like that, pairs, the official BTO estimate, but that swells to about 150,000 in the autumn-winter passage when we get lots of European birds that come and spend the winter with us. And they're now leaving their coast, so anybody who lives around the coast who's been used to having them all through the winter, they're disappearing now. Particularly the British breeding birds are heading back to the inland breeding sites. The European ones tend to leave a little bit later because winter's a bit harsher in its breeding grounds in Northern Europe. So it sounds like quite a lot of birds really, but it isn't. And anyway, numbers are no guarantee of safety. The Eskimo curlew is one of the 8 species of curlew that exists on the planet. There it is, the lovely, lovely thing. And a book was written about it in 1954. I don't know if you've ever read it, but if you haven't, The Last of the Curlews by Fred Bosworth is so worth reading. And he wrote about, he quotes a bit of a poem, "When August comes, if on the coast you be, thousands of fine curlews you'll daily see." This is America he's talking about. Obviously the Eskimo curlew is a North American, South American species. And then he wrote, "On the 10th of August, 1860, the curlews appeared in great numbers. And we saw one flock which may have been 1 mile long and nearly as broad. There must have been in that flock 4,000 or 5,000. The sum total of their notes sounded at times like the wind whistling through the ropes of 1,000-ton vessel." That was written in 1860. Well, 2 million were shot per year as they migrated between North and South America. They were coming up. Mainly they were shot on their journey south when they'd spent the breeding season sort of filling up on berries and so on. but also when they were migrating back up to their breeding season, because they ate a lot of the little tiny little locusts that used to be very, very popular, very common in North America, but which gradually went extinct because of habitat loss. So they were shot and they lost their food source. And the last known photograph was in 1962, there it is. And there was a sighting in Barbados in 1963, but they've not been seen since and are now considered extinct. So shot on migration, both north and south. So numbers are no guarantee of success. It doesn't take that long for them to disappear. And but this is how we will normally see them at the moment around the coasts, 150,000, as I said. And they're kind of a browny, grey bird with a bit of white on it next to brown grey mud on water. But because they're quite large, about the size of a mallard duck with very long legs, they kind of stick out. So you do see them and you do notice that bill. And as I said, it's not just the way they look, it's the way they sound. And a poet, Alan McClure, wrote Schrodinger's Curlew, actually one poem I absolutely love. And the first part of it says, on the face of it, there isn't much about this bird to stop me in my tracks. Brown, oblivious, busy with the ground. It totters along on stilted legs, probing among the frozen fields. But then it opens that amazing bill, and out comes the most wonderful sound, which we all know, and particularly you guys from Buxton and Derbyshire, lucky things will hear it so much from now on. And then, untouched by my musing, he says about the curlews, the bird spreads its wings and lifts, naming itself with a long, pure note. And in my heart, in two states, leaps and breaks. And what he's doing there is capturing the double sort of nature of the curlew's call, that sort of bittersweet sound. We can't quite work out whether it's ecstatic and happy or whether it's sad and mournful. And that's because it very carefully and very cleverly mixes major and minor keys in its call. So it is very much a call of two states. So let's have just a quick listen to it to remind ourselves. So let's just for a minute or so lose ourselves in the springtime call of the curlew, which is really beautiful.
Else to understand me. And there's a
music as desolate, as beautiful as your loved places, mountainy marshes and glistening mudflats by the stealthy sea. Another poem by poet Norman McCaig. And I hope that took you to somewhere special. Those private moments, I think, when you stand and listen to a curlew call, either on a mudflat or on a moor or in a meadow. Very, very beautiful sound. So that's where they spend the winter. That's Morecambe Bay, and that's a photograph I took literally just before setting off on my curlew walk. And believe it or not, there are loads of curlews out there. You just can't really see them. But then this time of year they come inland, and many of them, most of Britain's curlews go to the uplands, to the moors and rough pasture and rough grasslands of northern England, Scotland and Wales. So if we have 48,000 curlews, the vast majority of those will be in upland areas. We think we have about no more than 500 pairs in a line in lowland Britain, south of Birmingham. So they are an upland and northern species mainly. And that's where, just one more, because I do love things written about curlews. Lord Edward Grey, the great statesman, but also ornithologist who founded the Edward Grey Institute, or the Grey Institute in Oxford, named after him, talks about that sound, which we've just listened to, and which is so beautiful. Of all the bird songs or sounds known to me, there is none that I would prefer than the spring notes of the curlew. The notes do not sound passionate, They suggest peace, rest, healing, joy, an assurance of happiness past, present, and to come. To listen to curlews on a bright, clear April day, with the fullness of spring still in anticipation, is one of the best experiences that a lover of birds can have. And on a still day, one can almost feel the air vibrating with the blessed sound. Isn't that a very beautiful piece of writing? And at this particular moment in time, we could do with curlews calling right across Europe, couldn't we? Suggesting peace, rest, healing, and joy. But in the uplands, at the turn of the century, which is where basically the curlews were confined to the uplands, something was sort of taking off big time in the sort of 18th and 19th century, which was shooting in the uplands. This is a photograph taken from about 1900. And the advent, the spread of grouse shooting, the management of the moors, the control of predators up there, seems to suggest that the curlews did very well. And they kind of took off and flew down to the lowlands. The population did expand in the uplands. And they came down and landed in the lowland areas. And they found themselves in really lovely places. They found themselves in insect-rich, soft soils and meadowland. And they really loved the old-fashioned farmland that we had in the early part of the 20th century. And they started to settle in really well, and they really were expanding south and eastwards. There weren't any breeding records in the southeast of England until about 1942, which is quite interesting. And then we moved the goalposts. The Second World War challenged the old-fashioned way of farming, and we intensified to stop ourselves from starving ever again. And farming went through a tremendous revolution in the second half of the 20th century. I just jotted down a few of the major things that changed for the curlew. Loss of its habitat as land was just completely transformed, bigger, better, faster machinery, increased use of pesticides and herbicides, switch to silage, which means multiple cutting in the meadows every year, increased stocking density, and all of the sort of changes in the countryside and the growth of urbanization in the second half of the 20th century, with lots of human-produced food everywhere. We've had a general increase, a big increase in generalist predators across the country. We now have the densest population of crows of any country in Europe and the second densest of foxes. So the huge, massive changes to the UK in the second part of the 20th century, particularly in the agricultural sector, and all of those things impacted ground nesting birds like curlews. There they go. These guys have done really, really well. And once we stopped persecuting badgers, they have come back. The terrible persecution of the birds of prey in the uplands caused by the grouse shooting, namely, and pheasant shooting. Thank God, most of the birds of prey are resoundingly coming back, with one or two exceptions, as we all know. But foxes, crows, stoats, weasels, buzzards, massive increase in these creatures in this country, all of which is to celebrate. But as they have increased, ground nesting birds like curlews have decreased because of the pressures on them, and there's a huge imbalance. Another problem in the uplands has been the spread of forestry. Again, a second post, the sort of during the Second World War and onwards, and a huge increase to plant forests now due to mitigate against climate change. Huge forestry pressure in the uplands. And again, another pressure bearing down on the bird's habitat. So the UK has lost half of its breeding birds in 20 years. So these are figures from the BTO. Look at the breeding bird figures going down there. Look at the loss in grey on the map. And these figures are a bit old now, but that's about 120,000 birds we've lost, about 5,500 a year. And by 2015, the Eurasian curlew was the most pressing bird conservation priority in the UK. And I think that came as a real surprise to people, because you still do see large numbers along the coasts, but they're very long-lived birds. They'll live up to 30 years old. So they'll keep coming back to their breeding sites and keep going to the coast, but they're not producing any chicks. The situation, that's a very precarious situation and a non-sustainable situation to be in. So there we are, 1994 to 2015. Look at that. Look at that plunging graph there. Or if you like it in bar charts, Southern Ireland had around about 5,000 breeding pairs of curlews. In the 1980s, it now has no more than 135. Northern Ireland, roughly the same sort of loss. And a few more in Northern Ireland. The RSPB do a very good job of and put a lot of effort into looking after curlews there, but very few, maybe 250 pairs in Northern Ireland. Wales is in a dire situation, and BTO predicts that Wales will lose curlew as a breeding bird within 10 years. They have around, nobody knows, to be honest, to be sure how many there are in Wales, maybe 300 to 400 pairs. Southern England, as I say, we have around about, I think, maximum 500 pairs in the south of England. It's not looking great. So that's why in 2016, I set off on a great big walk and across Ireland, Wales and England. And that's me just setting up on the boat, going over to Ireland. But I set off on April the 21st, and that's because it is the feast day of this grand chap here in the boat called St. Beno. And St. Beno was a Welsh saint, and he, in the 7th century, and he dropped his prayer book into the ocean. And legend tells us that a very, very, very strong curlew flew out from the shore, picked up his prayer book and took it to the shore to dry. And St. Beno was so grateful. He blessed the curlew and said, "May you be forever protected." And his feast day is April the 21st. It's also the first sort of average laying date for curlews in our part of Europe. So that seemed like a very good day to start my walk. And there it is. That's a very rough map. But basically started in the west of Ireland, went through Ireland, Wales and England and ended up on the Wash. Took about 6 to 7 weeks. And it took me through all these habitats that we've been talking about, the uplands, the sort of central belt, the great cereal belts of the east, the drained wetlands, and ended up on the coast. And everywhere there were the same problems that we talked about. And everywhere I became more and more alarmed at what I was hearing and what I was seeing. And so when I got back, I organised 4 conferences, one in Ireland, top left, and that was at the end of 2016. 2017 in Southern England, bottom left. 2018, the Welsh Curlew Conference, bottom right, and the Scottish one up on the top right there. I also established World Curlew Day, which falls on April the 21st. And I hope everybody is writing that down in their diary. World Curlew Day, April the 21st. And if you can do anything to raise the awareness of curlews, whatever it is, coffee morning, give talks, go and find them out on the moors, I don't know, tell school kids, whatever it is that you want to do, paint a picture. Curlew Action is running a poetry and painting competition. If you'd like to do something and submit that to us, anything that celebrates curlews on World Curlew Day. But not only those 4 conferences, Prince Charles, who absolutely loves curlews as well, hurrah for that. And he held 2 of his own symposium, one on a hotel in Dartmoor and one at Highgrove. I also organised, along with then Theresa May's environmental advisor, Lord Randall, a meeting at 10 Downing Street where we brought together scientists, conservationists and politicians, policymakers, to talk about the future of curlews and what can be done. And then just a year ago, we are celebrating our 1-year anniversary. DEFRA gave seed money to start what's called the Curlew Recovery Partnership England. That's us in the middle, that's our logo. And we have a steering group of those organisations, which you can see around. I'm the chair, and a guy called Professor Russell Wynne is the manager, and his is a full-time paid post. And we work with anybody and everybody who cares about curlews and wants to make a difference. So it's a really dynamic group, actually. Considering how busy everybody is, the commitment to curlew recovery is real. So let me just take you through some of the things that happened in the last couple of years, so we all get up to speed with how much has been going on. Rachel Taylor from the BTO has been doing fantastic work tagging, GPS tagging breeding birds, and then which was quite a new thing to do, getting data back, trying to understand how they were using the landscape in the breeding season. And she realised, and now we realise, how far they travel. This one arrived back in Wales and its breeding site, and actually then went on a 500 square mile dander around Wales before it came straight back to with 1 mile from where it was caught. And it always breeds in the same place. It's the thing about curlews, they're very site faithful. This one, once it had nested, even with its mate on the nest, did lots and lots of travelling around, using the whole landscape to go and feed. And at night, they discovered that the non-sitting bird, the bird that's not on the eggs, can travel 5-10 kilometres away, leaves its mate and goes and roosts and spends the night by the side of little lochs or certain places. They're very favoured places they go to, but can travel quite a long distance every night. And it does seem that they're using very specific places as well. So it's given us a much better, much deeper insight into how curlews are using the landscape. These are birds that use whole areas, not just one particular bit. And what Rachel found out was that tagging worked really well, that they were using the tag birds, used huge areas, including areas away from the breeding territory. Our birds were overlapping. Some key sites and fields seemed so important that everybody was using them. And they found out that one of their Welsh birds spends the winter in Cork, which was very nice to know. In the Severn and Avon Vales, very different habitat, very lowland, floodplain meadows, signs going up to ask people to keep their dogs on a lead. If you go down the M5, you might notice great big meadows and floodplains around Gloucester, and that's a big site for breeding curlews. Have about 35 to 6 pairs, but they usually only find about 25 nests, and we never get more than just a handful of chicks. Nil some years, maybe 8, and a good year, but very, very low breeding success, very low, mainly predation and silage cutting. Nests are very difficult to find actually in meadowland, so trials are ongoing and just about to start again this year with drones with heat-seeking cameras underneath, and it helps you to locate nests. And it is the results are not bad. They are very promising, although it's quite an expensive and skilled thing to do. The drones are picking up roosting birds or nesting birds. The New Forest is another big area. They've got about 40 pairs, and that's down from 120, just 130 in 1994. So a big drop in the number of birds in the New Forest. Very different habitat again, wet mires and heaths. Huge numbers of people, obviously, in the national park. So disturbance is a major factor. And so lots of signs go up. 13.5 million people go to the New Forest, large proportion of those to walk their dogs. And they run around and disturb the birds off the nests. So there's a big drive to try and keep dog walkers, to keep their dogs under control, particularly in the nesting areas. Again, massive amount of predation of the eggs, usually just within hours of being laid. But in the New Forest do a lot of putting thermochrons or thermal loggers so they can find out when the birds are being predated. That's measuring the temperature of the nest. And this is a successful nest. So daytime up and down temperatures to begin with, then a long period of incubation where the temperature remains the same. And then once hatching, off they go. This is a nest that has been predated. The bird keeps getting disturbed off the nest, sits down for a little bit longer, and then at some point in the evening, it gets predated and the bird abandons, and the temperature of the nest goes back to an oscillating day-night temperature again. So thermal logging helps us to understand when it was predated and how often the bird is being disturbed. And what we have to do with nest cameras, another thing that's put up everywhere, is just how much of a problem sheep are. Sheep absolutely love curlew eggs, and they shove the bird off the nest and eat the eggs, which is amazing. And that it really is quite common to find that. And in the Shropshire area, big project, Curlew Country, they had over 2 years, about 40 nests, I think, and not a single chick ever survived. And foxes and badgers seem to be the biggest problem in Shropshire. There we are, eggs laid 73, chicks hatched 30, fledged chicks no more than 3 that year. So getting chicks to actually hatch and even more to fledge is a massive problem. And so lots of projects on head starting have started in the south. Head starting is a well-known conservation technique, actually, used for birds that are highly endangered, and has been used very successfully on black-tailed godwits and spoonbill sandpipers. But for the first time a couple of years ago, it was done in Curlew Country in Shropshire, and then Slimbridge went and collected eggs from airfields. Now, a lot of military airfields destroy curlew nests because the birds are considered a flying hazard. But when Slimbridge said, well, please don't destroy them, can we have your eggs? The army, the military were very, very helpful. And the eggs were taken to Slimbridge, and lots of chicks were hatched. There they are, and they're growing up and put out into these bigger and bigger pens until eventually they're released. And these birds, it's quite exciting this year. This was in 2019, and we hope that this year some will actually come back to breed. So it was difficult to monitor last year because of COVID, but this year we're hoping to see how many of these tag birds will actually come back. So that's what's happening to birds around the country. Habitat loss. There's 3 major causes of decline: habitat loss, agricultural practices, and predation. So hence my interest in predators. And these are, shots of birds that have been predated. And that's why I became so interested. You see a fox top left, and in the center there taking the eggs. Badgers, big predators in some areas. The bottom left, the curlew, has got a very damaged throat. That's blood around its throat. It was attacked on its nest. That bird did survive that season. And also buzzards, red kites, and so on will take chicks from the fields. So I began to be interested because everywhere I went, everybody's attitude towards birds was to predators was different. It depended where you were and who you talked to. Very much I found a sort of urban countryside divide, sort of country sports, those people interested in shooting compared to the people who are very anti-shooting, and people who just literally were sort of like animal lovers and didn't want any control of any kind to be put on the animals, no matter how endangered the creatures they were eating. So broad and different across the country. In the city where I live, this was taken just down my street, I see foxes literally every day. And the other day I went for an evening walk with my dog, and there was just 4 separate foxes, and they always take my breath away. And they always bring that touch, excitement of the wild right into the city centre. And I actually love seeing them, and they perform a hugely important job in reminding inner city dwellers like myself that there is a wild world out there. For some people as well, they are very beautiful animals, and they're subject of art or stories. That's Roald Dahl's fantastic Mr. Fox, which is a wonderful story which turns sort of foxes into heroes. But out in the countryside, either on nature reserves or in game shooting areas, the fox is public enemy number 1. And thousands upon thousands are shot by nature reserve wardens, gamekeepers, you name it, every year, as well as so many deaths on roads and so on. And yet we still have a high population of foxes. Badgers. another creature, probably one I found the most complicated of all the animals I looked at. Badgers are utterly wonderful, recovering from terrible persecution. Now there are more badgers than foxes in the UK, but we don't see them so much. They're much shyer and not so much in the central cities. But so beloved of children's stories, Wind in the Willows and so on. This lovely image of the old man of the woods, the old Brock of the woods, very wise and very countryside character. Symbol of the wildlife trusts and also of Tesco's. Badgers take their soiled beddings out very frequently and keep their sets very clean and tidy. So they're on the coat of arms of Tesco's. We do love them. But we also get very upset when they rip hedgehogs inside out and eat them alive. There is a correlation between high badger numbers and hedgehog decline in some areas where the food is stressed. If there's lots of food around, they live very happily side by side. But in food-stressed areas, badgers will predate hedgehogs. So it's a sort of not a simple relationship between the two at all. And badgers don't do so well in cities, and hedgehogs do don't mind cities as long as cats and dogs leave them alone. So they're beginning to see a revival of hedgehogs in urban areas, but it's slow. Hedgehogs have had a terrible decline as well. So badgers are complicated species, and even more complicated by the fact that they're associated with TB.
That's the importance that it is.
So the sort of emotion around badger culling is absolutely, and particularly down here in the southwest, it's a huge issue, and very divisive and very upsetting for farmers and for anti-cull protesters. And then the next one, the controversy that ranges around wild birds, and something that you up there and me, because I grew up in the Staffordshire moorlands, the controversies around birds of prey and the shooting sector, particularly this magnificent creature, the hen harrier. And this, I think, of all the conflicts, the badger probably is the most complicated. The hen harrier is certainly one of the most divisive and difficult conservation conflicts that we have. Thankfully, hen harriers seem to be making a slow recovery, and there's more hen harrier chicks born the last couple of years than in the last 10. So there is a change going on, but the persecution of birds of prey over shooting areas is still very high, and a conflict that we have to sort out. We can shout and scream about it, but we have to sort it out, because if we don't sit down and talk and get a solution, the only thing that loses out is wildlife. And then in Scotland, another conflict which, unless you're up there, you don't really come across that much, but we're beginning to see a glimpse of it now. And this is the reintroduction of the white-tailed eagle. The white-tailed eagle completely eradicated in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, along with other birds of prey by gamekeepers and farmers, but now reintroduced back into the western part of Scotland. And a magnificent, extraordinarily wonderful bird. But it is huge, and you can't help but see it, and it attracts a lot of attention, and it's not that scared of people. So it really is a very obvious bird when you're up there. And it is accused of taking a lot of lambs from hill farms. Hill farmers find, life tough enough up in the west of Scotland. So when a great big bird of prey comes in and you see it sitting on a lamb, then it does get blamed for all sorts of things. The fact that the birds will only ever take, if they do take live lambs, and they mainly take dead ones, of which are a lot in Scotland, even if they do take the occasional live one, it's only going to be in a few tens a year. But, in a bad year in Scotland, 30% of hill lambs will die through malnutrition, starvation, and disease. The numbers are hugely skewed towards death from other causes, yet a very big and obvious predator like a white-tailed eagle gets blamed for a lot of the angst of land deaths. And as we saw so upsetting recently, 2 white-tailed eagles from the reintroduction project down on the Isle of Wight have died under circumstances which we don't know yet for sure, but there is some suspicion around their deaths, and they died near to game estates. So eagles are just one of the large predators. We're talking about bringing back wolves and lynx and wildcat. Very rarely hear people talk about bringing back bears, but you do occasionally. Of all these, the eagles are coming back slowly. Wildcats are next on the list and should be being released in the next couple of years in certain parts of Scotland. And Derek Gow down in Devon is determined to release wildcats down in certain parts of the southwest. Lynx is always on the agenda. Lynx, very much a woodland species, a deer specialist, and would do woodlands a lot of good to have lynx back. Wolves, have we got the heart to live with wolf packs? It's a big debate, and it will change undoubtedly. Bringing back these big predators will change the nature of Britain. Of course it will. They're top predators and they will have an effect. But much more important than the effect that they will have is our attitude. Are we predator ready? Are we ready to do what it takes to live alongside these creatures? We're finding it hard enough with foxes and crows and badgers. How are we going to get ourselves ready to live next to lynx and wildcats? It's a very, very interesting subject, and it will affect all of us. And a lot of the problems will arise because just out of fear and lack of knowledge. This is an image of somebody drew of what a rewilded Britain could look like if we do find it in our hearts to let these creatures come back. You know, skies with big predators in them, wildcats, lynx in trees. It's a very different vision of Britain, and it's a wonderful vision, and it's a very exciting vision. But we have to be ready to accept it and accept the restrictions that inevitably will be put on us. And that means restrictions on what we can do and what pets we allow out at night, and where we go. All sorts of things will bear down on us, and we have to be honest about how ready we are. And therefore, I started a campaign. This was quite a while ago now, and it's heating up quite nicely and is almost coming to fruition, to introduce a GCSE in natural history. The problems that we see in climate change and biodiversity loss, and the issues we talked about, trying to find ways to live with predators, all come down to the fact that we are so disengaged from the natural world. And as Ray DeYoung, an American environmental psychologist at the University of Michigan, said, if environmental education worked, we wouldn't be having the problems we're having. And I agree with that. Environmental education is not working. Statistics from 2019, children between the ages of 5 and 15, 50% don't know can't name a nettle. 75% can't name a robin. Is that really true? 80% don't know a bumblebee, and 90% couldn't tell you what a large white butterfly was. Are those statistics literally make your heart stop? Interestingly, I found how much has changed. These are questions from a 1940s biology paper. I thought they were really interesting. Name the species of birds which migrate into Britain in winter and describe the appearance and habits of any 3 of them. Could you imagine having that today? Name the species Cosidae, the goat moth, and give detailed description of the life history and appearance of one of them. And write a short account of the chief points in the life history, habits, and structure which distinguish the frog from the toad. That was in the 1940s. How far away have we got from children or adults being able to do those questions now? And it's a great shame, because Richard Louv, who wrote The Last Child in the Woods, such an important book in 2005, he was the one that talked about nature deficit disorder in children. He knew, he said, that the future will belong to the nature smart, those individuals, families, businesses, and political leaders who develop a deeper understanding of the transformative power of the natural world and who balance the virtual with the real. The more high-tech we become, the more nature we need. That was in 2005. How much more is that true today? So I sat down and I wrote a flyer. This is back in 2011. Why is GCSE natural history? Why is it needed? What will it cover? And I sent it out to loads of people, and I got lots of comments back. I got comments back from David Attenborough and all sorts of people saying, great, go for it. Let's get on with it. And so it seemed important to me to start this campaign, because as this wonderful Senegalese environmentalist Baba Dioum said in 1968, in the end, we will conserve only what we love, and we will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. So the GCSE campaign really became quite a passion. So fired up by all of that and the response I got to my flyer, I, in 2017, put out a develop a GCSE in natural history petition, one of those UK government petitions. And within really short time, I got over 10,000 signatures. And then it was suddenly pulled. It was pulled after a couple of weeks because Theresa May pulled the snap election, and you can't have petitions running at a time of election. But 10,000 is enough to get a response from the government. And the government response came back saying, basically, get back in your box. It said, on the basis that natural history subject content is covered in the national curriculum and in a number of GCSEs, and given the thorough and careful work that has gone into developing, designing and approving reformed qualifications, the government does not currently intend to introduce an additional GCSE in natural history. So that was back in 2017, and that was a very definite no. But I wasn't going to give up. I didn't know what to do, but I wasn't going to give up. So 2018, I got contacted by this wonderful woman, Caroline Lucas, who said, just really like that idea, how can I help? And she got us to talk to Michael Gove, who was then the Secretary of State for the Environment. And Michael Gove was very supportive and very encouraging. And he put us on to Cambridge Assessment. And Tim Oates, who was sort of Director of Research, if you like, for Cambridge Assessment, who run the exam board OCR. And the three of us then got together and did an awful lot of campaigning. Never underestimate Caroline Lucas's political skills. She's an astonishing political operator. And Tim, passionate about natural history and really took it seriously. We did a public consultation, which is part of the process that you have to have before you propose a GCSE to the government. And the overwhelming response, over 2,000 to 3,000 people responded. And look at those figures, how many agreed with what we were trying to do. And the support from young people was overwhelming. And then the government commissioned the Dasgupta report. The Dasgupta report looked at the connection between biodiversity and the economy of the world, of the different economic systems of the world. And Professor Partha Dasgupta, an Oxford academic, was commissioned to make this report. And he came up with the report that was published last year. And part of that report is on how do we persuade the people of the world that natural history, that biodiversity is essential to economic systems, because that's the conclusion he came to, that our economic systems are fundamentally dependent on a healthy natural world. So he decided that part of this report should be on education. And I was put in touch with him and a few other people, and we had a meeting. And then afterwards he wrote to me saying, would you write me a document about the ideas between the natural history and young people, which I did, which then formed part of the basis for that chapter on the education. And when he gave the public launch of the report, the Dasgupta report, last year. It was done online because of COVID, but it was publicly sort of launched. He gave a big speech, which was filmed. And right at the end, he talked about nature in education. And I filmed it off the screen. So this is what he said right at the end of his launch last year.
The review ends with a plea that our education systems should introduce nature studies from the earliest stages of our lives and revisit them in the years we spend in secondary and tertiary education. The conclusion we should draw from this is unmistakable. If we care about our common future and the common future of our descendants, we should all, in part, be naturalists.
So there we are. It's been quite a journey from caring about curlews, being embroiled in some of the biggest conservation issues that we face, the controversies and the sort of agonies around how we deal with living with some of the predators like hen harriers, badgers, foxes, crows, ravens, and so on. How it's been so interesting to try to navigate that space and try to understand it from everybody's point of view. And also at the same time, trying to make an argument for greater understanding of the natural world throughout society. We need a nature literate society. We need a society that loves and cares and is passionate about the world around it. Britain has produced Charles Darwin and Gilbert White and David Attenborough, and that great tradition of being naturalists is about to be lost as this next generation and future generations get more and more divorced from the natural world. So all of it mixed in together, education, curlews, predators. So it's been quite a journey for me. It's been a fascinating one. It's been a painful one at times, but one I think it's well worth going in. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you for listening. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand back to Rachel, and I hope that's given you a feel for the complexities of education and nature in society.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mary. That was a really wide-ranging talk, and I would guess that people will have lots of questions. What we'd like to do with the questions, if you want to put your videos back on, you can do, though we are still live streaming. And you can either use the little hand that appears, the raised hands under your actions button at the bottom of the screen, or you can just sort of
the rejection, the struggle, the grind, honestly. So I like that you brought that up because I think the time that LinkedIn has this kind of form of like Instagram where you're showing your success and your celebration. People aren't seeing how much struggle, how you
We've lost Rachel for a minute.
How much help you have to get where you are. So I think that's a really good example.
Rachel, I think you've frozen.
I find that LinkedIn can sometimes be, the same way some other social media can affect you, make you feel like you're less than or you're not doing well enough. LinkedIn has become that kind of environment as well. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to.
Sorry. So I just mentioned that LinkedIn doesn't have a section.
You all love technology, eh? Any questions?
Please continue.
Apologies, everybody. We seem to have a technical difficulty. We seem to have lost Rachel, and maybe some interference going on. So if you could just bear with us, and I'm sure we'll see if we can get hold of Rachel and Dave to see if we can sort out the problem. I think what Rachel was going to suggest is if you don't use the raised hand icon, is perhaps you could type your question into the chat box on the bottom, and then hopefully we can maybe hand over to Mary to start answering some questions.
Of companies in all fields did not get any of those offers. And Google was the one, my dream
company, and that was actually my second to last internship interview that I had for that summer. And I thankfully was able to get it. The moral of the point in that story is, one, be persistent, don't give up. But two, also very, very much prepare for what you want your.
Well, it looks like Zoom has been taken over by another meeting.
that I offer from, but I did.
I think
extensively.
unfortunately we don't have control of the meeting in order to be able to mute anybody else.
I love that it paid off. That's so inspiring. I think for a lot of us, we're hiring people right now. So it's really good to hear that, Zuri. Thank you. Anybody else want to mention about, before we go back to Frances and ask her about it, anyone else want to mention about
It's like the Americans are taking over, folks. I can't see any way out of this, because if the person who set the meeting up has bombed out, there's nothing we can do, I'm afraid.
Back to the whole, like, you know,
the video went froze, didn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
There's somebody called Amelia Sutton who had a question. Amelia, are you still there?
To expect to like what you see here, right? So, and that's because, yeah, I was
I'm not quite sure what your question meant. If you wanted to expand on it, I'm happy to answer.
Korea, adopted by
the trouble with bleed through, I think,
mother German and my father English, and
I don't think we can get out of this one, folks. It's like we're going to have to bail out.
Very different, right? Like, as you can imagine. So
well, I'll keep my line open in case anybody calls back. But if you just in case, Rachel,
I think
really
you know, I completely understand if it's too difficult.
Do it right, like it comes up.
We can use the chats. There's a question from Joe, for instance.
That's kind of the interesting thing.
Somebody, well, if Amelia Sutton wants to expand a little bit on what she meant by the problem is we would need to try and control it. I'm not sure what it is. If we release them, it could have a huge impact on the food chain. Not quite sure what it is, but if you could
be able to
qualify, you know, that would be interesting. But Jill Williamson, which countries, if any, are good examples of the approach to education and advocating? We've looked at this very carefully, and we don't know anyone
that's just going on, even though the person
that teaches it. So if we did do it, we could be a world leader, which is what I keep telling the Minister for Education. I mean, it is time for Britain to lead the way and really put natural history and understanding of the natural world back into the forefront of education. Because as far as I can see, or that I've found out, nobody does exactly that. But it to me is a complete no-brainer. So where we are at the moment is that we're just literally just waiting for the Minister of Education to make up his mind whether to say yes or no. I had a meeting with him in January, and he was very enthusiastic, he was very friendly, and leave it with me, I'll be considering it, I'll let you know, but still haven't heard anything, and we're now into March. So it is one of the most frustrating things I've ever done in my life.
You could tell him that there might be a knighthood in it for him.
Yes, I could, although it's not my power to give it, unfortunately.
Excuse me, Mary. I don't know how familiar you are with Zoom. This is Louise part of the Thought Club committee. If you're able to make, it looks like you're a host.
Yeah.
You
might have the option of
so, you know, a lot of times people
try muting everybody.
By Microsoft as a professional in your career. And it's not because I know everything about Microsoft, but it's because I'm able to share knowledge confidently. And when I don't happen to know something, I'm able to share that with my network.
If you can see people on the screen, I don't know whether you can see on the bottom left of the person speaking, there's a microphone.
Yeah. Somebody must be open.
That box. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
well done.
Mute. I'll try and mute people. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Oh, Rachel is the host. Rachel back? No.
Yeah. Hello. Hi.
Oh, hi, Rachel.
I really apologise. Our internet just completely crashed. So, what's been going on while I've been away?
Oh, we've had a party.
Oh,
yeah.
We were taken over by an American meeting.
We were, sorry, I was muting everybody, but that was working quite well. But
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Right.
the person called Laura seems to keep dropping in their microphone seems to keep coming on, so I don't know if it's possible to kick them out.
Yes, I was very tempted to do that, but I kept muting her. So okay, I'll try and get rid of Laura. And in the meantime, have there been any questions yet?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions while you're dealing with that. Amelie Sutton, thank you for clarifying what you meant, Amelie. The lynx and wildcat, if we release them, we will have to keep close monitoring on them to ensure they're not causing problems and damaging populations. That's absolutely true. Of course, that is true. And I think that's one of the things I write about in Beak, Tooth and Claw, is that we can introduce these magnificent predatory animals, the lynx and the wildcat. But what happens when they do start causing problems? And, you know, if lynx do start, I mean, people are worried about them taking sheep, they're so woodland focused. It would be very unlikely, I would have thought, but you never know. Wildcat as well, what if they started impacting other species that were endangered? Are we prepared to cull them? And I think that's a very, very big question. That we talk about reintroductions, but reintroductions in a crowded country like this won't just be a free-for-all, particularly if people get nervous and they're around centres of population and so on. Are we prepared to do what it would take to cull them, and what effect psychologically will that have on us all? It's a fascinating question, and I agree they'll have to be monitored, and we will have to have some kind of mechanism in place. But who decides when enough is enough, and how all that takes place, I don't think has been thought through yet. So one of my things, that's what I mean by are we predator ready? One of the things that I mean by that. It's a good question. And then what are your thoughts on the impact of predator numbers on release on 35 millions every year? Yes, completely. And this is the big question that everybody is debating at the moment. And an awful lot of my time with the Curlew Recovery Partnership is around that question. It seems a very, very obvious link to make, that high numbers of game birds sustain high numbers of predators. I mean, you know, that just seems like such an obvious link to make. And I'm sure that is the case in some areas, but there are areas where there are no game birds, huge numbers of crows and foxes in Ireland, for example, and there are no game birds there. So it's not just a simple cause and effect. Undoubtedly, they have an effect. How that effect is worked out in pure numbers and what other things are coming in and out around keepered estates, now keepered, so they're probably keeping down predators as well. It's a subject which is hopefully going to be the topic of a couple of PhDs to try and tease apart all this complicated sort of situation between predator and prey, because it's very obvious, it's very easy to draw obvious conclusions, but whether they're the right ones is something that not everybody's convinced we know the answers to yet. That's, I think.
Okay, further questions?
Rachel, one here, please.
Yes, is that Sue Jones? Yeah.
Well, it's John Bland actually is going to ask the question.
Yeah,
I volunteer at my local park, and the school that adjoins the park like to bring groups of children to do pond dipping and the like. But what we find is that they want to hand the children over to us, and the teachers have no interest whatsoever in the natural history that they've been asked to teach. Do you think there would be enough teachers if there was a qualification?
I think it's all part of assessment of a school, definitely. And very often things like pond dipping and so on are sort of extracurricular activities. But if it's certainly the response that we've had from teachers is, I would love to teach this. Just give me the chance. I'd love that. Can I train to teach it? I've had young conservationists saying I'd leave my job and go into teaching so I could teach it. I think once there's a structure there, that's a proper examined structure, I think that will be very different to bringing kids out for, to do some pond dipping. I think there's a different mindset around that, hopefully.
Okay. Next question. Can't see anybody waving. Anybody who hasn't got their video on? Anybody want to ask another question? Yeah, Louise, you just need to unmute.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned about the curlews being fairly long-lived. I just wondered how long they're able to breed for.
They start breeding around about 2 to 3 years old, and then they'll keep going. And it has been estimated that to keep the population stable, they only need to have successfully fledged one chick every other year, but they're not even managing that, nowhere near managing that. So yeah, the situation's pretty bad. And the fact that they're long-lived is in their favour. So, they do give us time to try and get these things right, hopefully. But although we're not doing that well at the moment, I have to say. And Graham Appleton, who is a wader person, worked out that just to hold the line with the number of curlews we have at the moment, we need to be producing an extra 10,000 chicks a year. So we've got to find 10,000 chicks a year just to keep the population steady. And that's a lot of chicks. And as I said, in southern England, 500 pairs, maybe last year. It's hard to know last year because of COVID, but the last time we could do any counting, we probably produced 50, maybe. So not going so well, to be honest.
Mary, I read James Rebank's latest book and also heard him speaking at Buxton Festival. And he described how he felt that everything was fine on his farm because he'd still got curlews. And then he realised that they lived for so long, and he realised that the ones on his farm were no longer breeding. And I just wonder, what's your view of how understanding and knowledgeable farmers are generally about this, and do they understand the scale of the problem well or not?
I think it's hard to generalize. I mean, some are really, really engaged. And over the last few years, it was James asked me up to go and talk to his group of farmers. And I went up there and gave a talk, and everybody was so interested and engaged with it. I think on the whole, my experience is that when this subject is raised and is explained, farmers are really, really interested. But there is a real problem with dairy and beef farmers because they have to have silage to feed their cows. It's not an option. They have to have it. And at the moment, there's no compensation. So if a farmer says, I really want to encourage curlew, so I won't cut that field till those chicks are fledged, it's a matter of sacrificing that field. And we're working very hard with the government to try to come up with mechanisms whereby they can be compensated, or there's a silage exchange scheme or something, because it's not just curlews, it's skylarks and lapwing and all sorts of other birds as well. And I think that if we could get that working, that would make a huge difference. I don't think it's a lack of interest on farmers' part. I think there's certainly a lack of knowledge in some areas, but it's much more to do with the system that we've locked ourselves into. Is so intensive, and milk and meat is so cheap that that there's just an impossible equation to try and balance on that one. So all we can do is try and get different agricultural schemes through which help farmers do the right thing. And in my experience, most of them do want to do it.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you very much. A great talk, and I enjoyed it. And what I particularly admired was the fact that you weren't coming up with firm or definite answers to the complex issues that you've raised. And I suppose I'm searching for some longer term hope and optimism about whether, reasonable answers that are peaceful and not sort of opposed can emerge. And I'm just wondering the extent to which you feel that research and getting more hard facts about these things by doing studies, and your whole idea of education, that if we actually had a much more informed population, then at least these issues could be more calmly, rationally sort of explored, and whether that's where the sort of optimism lies.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. In the longer term, yes, that is where the optimism lies, and that's why I'm so passionate about it. In the short term, we probably can't wait for lots of PhDs to get through and that the information to be filtered through society. So there is a sort of short, medium and long-term strategy with this. And so the education is definitely part of the longer term strategy. In the short term, I mean, I really, really struggle with this because it's not that easy to navigate and nobody wants to step into this space, quite understandably, because it's a really unpleasant place to be if you're being fired at, I can tell you. But all you can do is try to speak the truth as you see it and not blame. And there's too much name calling and division, understandably, because emotions are very high on different sides. But, you know, we do not want war. Nobody wins in a war. And we have to, and is it so poignant at the moment, find ways to use language everybody understands. And curlews actually are a very good ambassador for that, because nobody wants to kill curlews. They're not a sports bird, they're not dangerous, they don't harm anybody, they don't damage crops, they don't do anything. They're just great, you know, and everybody agrees that they're lovely. So it's a starting point to say, for example, on a grouse moor, let's stick my neck out here, on a grouse moor, you know, curlews do well on grouse moors, there's no doubt about that, because predators are controlled and habitat is managed. That's why hen harriers do well on grouse moors. That's why grouse do well on grouse moors. They all need the same type of thing. So we can say, look, on a grouse moor, you have very important populations of curlews, but there is a problem that we need to talk about, you know, because we want you guys to continue into the future doing what's very important for you and your tradition, but at the moment it's not working. At the moment, there are too many problems. So let's sit down and work together. How can we do that? I'm about to do exactly that with big landowners up in the northeast of Scotland, of England. And there's no point pussyfooting about and saying everything's lovely, but there's no point finger pointing either, because neither of those two are going to find solutions. But if you can help everybody to come up with the solutions themselves, rather than tell people what to think, way too many people telling us what to think, not enough people saying, well, what do you think? You tell me what you think. It's your world, your tradition. You see the world in this way. This is where we want to get to. How are we going to get there? And how are we going to get everyone to follow on? That's my approach, but let's see if it works. We probably need all of us in the end, the street fighters and those that don't like street fighting, but let's see where we get to. But there's a lot of people trying, and that gives me hope. That gives me hope.
Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have a final question? Anybody? Yeah. I'm just trying to scan everybody.
There's a lady there, I think.
Yes. Is
just a thought, Mary. Is there anybody in Europe doing similar things to what you're doing in this country?
In terms of education or in
other trying to protect them and you know, support them in the way.
In curlews, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, there's some very good people working in Europe, and you know, one of the reasons I love them as well is they're a real connection to our European friends. So the only country where they seem to be doing all right is Finland. That's the only country. Everywhere else they're declining. But there is a strong sort of curlew loving across Europe, if you like, and we're all talking to each other and seeing, because a lot of our wintering birds are from Poland, Estonia, Finland, Sweden. That's those sorts of countries, and so it's a very good tie that ties us together. And it's the European pressure which stopped hunters in France shooting them in the winter on the coasts. That was pure collective effort across Europe that did that, and that moratorium still holds at the moment. So yes, I think there's good reasons to be hopeful. It's not the will to help them. It's the mechanism of, it's the agricultural and economic mechanisms that we're tied into, which is the problem. And that's what we have to try and find a solution to.
Yeah.
Quickly.
Right, well, thank you very much. And thank you for the range of questions. Thank you.
Yes, excellent questions. Thank you.
Hey, we did well. Mary, obviously it's been a wonderful evening. I'm so sorry that our internet dropped out, so I missed a bit of it. But thank you so much for the talk. Thank you so much for answering all the questions so thoughtfully. And if people would like to unmute themselves, perhaps we could give Mary a round of applause for the talk she's given us.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And just before everybody goes, that concludes our Zoom talks for this season. But Buxton Field Club have one more meeting left, which is in 2 weeks' time. It combines our AGM, which will be a brief part of the meeting, but then the main thing that we're doing, because it's for the first time that we'll have all seen each other for at least a year, we thought it'd be really nice for people to come together and to bring together some of our best stories about the natural world, things that we've seen, things that we've noticed, things that have made us happy, brought us joy perhaps in lockdown. And that we want to capture those, both in talking about them, but also in establishing some postcards for the future, with the idea of passing on our experiences and our knowledge, maybe to the next generation, and capturing those in some way. And Sian Tower, who's both a poet and a writer and works with people in this field, and she's a member of the Field Club, will be leading that session. So please come along, please come and just share your experiences, come and talk to each other, see each other face to face, and that will be the final meeting for Buxton Field Club for this season, and then our summer programme will start. So hope to see you there in 2 weeks, and that will be at Buxton Methodist Church Hall. So Mary, sorry to have to make you sit through the announcement for that, but should you be in Buxton, you would be most welcome.
Thank you.
So thank you once again to everybody, especially to Mary. Have a good rest of the weekend, and hopefully we'll see some of you at least in 2 weeks' time.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.